One.
Hello everyone, this is a special video presentation for everybody at MBN who sat through my talk on GDPR, and at the time we didn't actually have the PowerPoint, so I thought it'd be quite nice to go through it again with the slides, with the words. So GDPR, don't panic. What is it? Well, it's called the General Data Protection Legislation, so shortened to GDPR. It was adopted in April 2016, but on the 25th of May this year, it will become enforceable. And what it does is it overrides the previous Data Protection Act 1998. And as I said this morning, it's partly to do with the fact that in 1998, technology was so different, and I was using a dial-up internet connection. I don't know about you, but if you think about the modern world now, clearly the Data Protection Act 1998 was not sufficient to cope with what's going on in the world right now. And it applies to all of us, whether we are what's called a data subject, so in other words, the person on whom other people hold our data, or whether we are businesses that hold data ourselves, we have to be compliant. We don't have a choice. So why? Why has this come about? Well, in the social media age, we're able to transport more data more quickly and more effectively than ever before. And on the news at the moment, there's the big issue of Cambridge Analytica, and did they take data from Facebook, and did that help have political ramifications? So you can see that data is actually extremely valuable. In the old days, we'd have commodities such as oil. This was the thing that was measured around the world, but other items, gold, sugar, whatever, these actual physical commodities were the things that had the value. Well, today it's data, because with data we can do so much. So GDPR will give us control of our data and how other people use it. And it's quite good because it means that other organizations must hold and use and protect our data in an appropriate way. And the ramifications of that is, if I was to kind of summarize it in one sentence, it's about only storing the necessary data for the necessary amount of time. So let's have a look at what sort of data we're talking about. And we're going to kick off with something called personally identifiable information. So what is PII? Okay, well, it's any information about a person that can be used to identify them, the obvious things being your name, address, date of birth. But it can also be information about purchases, it can be your financial history, and it can be things like CCTV recording. So it's pretty much anything that anyone can hold on you, which in some way, either directly or indirectly, they can trace back to you. Now, there is what's called high-risk data, which is completely separate. These are things which I guess you might call them personal things. So stuff to do with race, religion, sexual orientation, criminal convictions. In other words, if this data fell into the wrong hands, it could compromise you. It could really invade your privacy, or perhaps someone could use it against you. So there are different levels of PII. So, as a small business owner now, what must you do? Well, the first thing is register with the Information Commissioner's Office. You haven't got a choice anyway, so do it before the 25th of May. I believe it's only £35. It's very straightforward. Google ICO. There will actually be a link later to help you connect with them. But literally, just get that done. It's a 5-minute job, and then that's the first step. You also need to appoint a data protection officer, or what's called a responsible person within your business. Now, if it's just you in your business, because you're a sole trader, guess what? You are the data protection officer. You haven't got to do anything formally, but you just have to make sure that if someone says, who is the data protection officer, you've got someone that you can allocate. And if you are in a larger company, it can't be some junior member of staff who's just been given the job because no one wants it. It must be someone with enough authority to make other people in the business comply if it's required. You also need to identify any data processors, and I'll give you two examples of companies that might apply to. So, for example, if you outsource your HR or your payroll to a different organization, then clearly they're going to hold data on your staff. So you want to know that they have a privacy policy and that they are compliant. Another example might be if you get an external organization to do your marketing for you, you'll give them access to your database of potential clients and they will be approaching them. So you need to make sure that your data processors are all identified. You also need to do a data audit. Now, the people who were at the MBN meeting, Jane gave us a great handout that you can use, which shows you all the things that you need to include in a data audit. But don't panic about this. Pretty much what you're doing is saying, well, why do I need this data? What's my process for collecting it? How long do I need it for? Who else will use it? Do I have a secure way of storing it and disposing of it? So you need to go through all the different ways that you hold data. So you might have a data audit for your suppliers, a different one for your clients, a different one for the people to whom you market. And that can stay on record, and then that shows that you're compliant if you're checked out. You also need a privacy policy, which ideally you will display on your website. Again, Jane had some very good feedback on this. You may want to have an internal privacy policy if you employ staff, as well as an external one which customers can access. And I do have a download which I can give you, which is from Ticket Tailor, which you can personalize to your own business. And if you have staff, you need to train them. So whether it's going through a presentation, something like this, or whether you're sending them on formal training, or whether you just sit down with them and explain what the ramifications are of the new legislation, keep a record that you've trained them and then you're compliant. And then finally, you must keep your data secure. So if it's electronic data, it must be in a computer or a device which is not accessible to anyone else. So you need to think about passwords and encryption. If it's physical paper data, it needs to be somewhere it can be locked up. If it's in a public place like an office where people are walking around, you need to have it in either a lockable cupboard or a lockable room and not leave things lying around. Now, this is interesting. The lawful basis on which you can hold data. People do get quite worried about what are the reasons that I'm allowed to hold data, and I'm going to go through them with you. So first of all, consent. If consent has been given, then the data subject has given you permission to contact them, and this will refer specifically to marketing activity. So this is where if you go onto a website and they say, do you want our newsletter or do you want our marketing material, you have to actively opt in to give consent. It's no longer implied, you have to opt in. So it is lawful to market to people once they've given consent, and that can be paper or electronic or verbal. Another lawful reason to hold data is because you have a contract. So either you are employing someone or you're working with someone, and you need to have something in writing to show that you're doing that. So it could be an employee, it could be a client, it could be a contractor. But if there's a contract, clearly you need to have the information about them so that you can contact each other and work together. Another lawful basis is to comply with a legal obligation. What this law isn't doing is it's not contradicting any other law. So if you come across something that says you must do this, it's the law, and it requires you to disclose or keep data, then obviously that's not going to be a problem if you do that. But you may need to demonstrate that it is a legal obligation. Now, another lawful basis is to protect the vital interests of the subject. And the example I'm going to give you here is if you're in hospital, you would really like a doctor who is treating you because you're sick to have all the relevant information about your case history, your age, your personal information if it affects your health, and your health record. So very high degree of secure data, but incredibly important. And then performance of a task within public interest. Now, this is really about things like the police. If you are I don't know, conducting a criminal investigation. Clearly, you're going to have access to information about the suspects, but you're allowed to do that because it's a reasonable thing to do if it's within the public interest. You wouldn't want a police officer to say, well, I can't pursue this person I believe to be a murderer because it's, I can't hold their data. It's clearly in the public interest to do that. So those are the main reasons. And they're all very valid, but for networkers, this is the one that I believe you're going to love. There is another category called legitimate interest, and let me explain what that's all about. Legitimate interest is when people have given you really quite advanced levels of consent. So let me take a networking group like MBN. We are all business people. We're trying to do business with other business people. So clearly it makes sense that we share phone numbers. We have a list that goes around every time we have a networking meeting, and it's got our data on it. It's got phone numbers, emails, names, and it would be crazy to go to a networking group that's about business and then not to network. So you have legitimate interest with anyone with whom you're in a networking group. Similarly, anyone who's actively inquired about working with you, absolutely, you've got a legitimate interest. You're not spamming them. They've inquired, you've responded. And similarly, existing clients or customers may have a legitimate interest in working with you in the future. So here is why this is important. If you go around asking for consent from people in the networking group, and when I was in the room, I think I had Jane sitting next to me, and I said something like, if I ask Jane if I have her consent to market to her from time to time, and she says no, then I have to remove her records from my database. However, under legitimate interest, I don't need to ask her that question because she is in the same networking group as me, and she legitimately is interested in having my information and in sending me hers. So legitimate interest is a great coverall for anyone you've worked with, anyone you properly know, your friends, your family, anybody at all with whom you've got a current or a potential strong business relationship. Remember, this legislation is about avoiding being spammed. So this legislation is focusing on bigger companies than sole traders and micro businesses. However, if they come knocking on your door, people from the ICO, you must show that you've at least taken proportionate steps. The chances are, if you haven't got it 100% right, but you showed that you've really sort of acted in good faith and you've tried your best and you've done sensible things, then there's a very good chance they'll say, well, look, don't do it again. Here's what you should be doing. Now go off and behave, rather than getting this really frightening 4% fine, 4% on annual turnover that we keep hearing about. So what are proportionate steps? Well, first of all, we've talked about having a privacy policy. So make sure you implement it. Don't just have words, implement it. Secondly, use encryption tools. And as Pasby was saying, if your website is secure, you'll see the little green padlock sign. So make sure that your website is secure. And you can use tools like WhatsApp, which is encrypted as well. One of the ones that I think quite a lot of people were quite surprised about is don't put email attachments containing PII and send them out to people. Now, and the example I gave was a CV. If you're going to send a CV to someone, you really need to put it into something like Dropbox or perhaps send it over an encrypted network like WhatsApp. But you can't just blanket send it as an attachment anymore. If you have a staff handbook, you need to update it to include your privacy policy. If you don't have a staff handbook, this is the perfect opportunity to start making a staff handbook. If it's only you, you might be thinking, well, why do I need to bother? But fingers crossed, you will expand, and at some point you'll need a staff handbook. So put this policy in your staff handbook. It's a starting point. You also need to gain consent for any marketing activities. So make sure that you now have an opt-in box either on your website, or if you collect paper consent, make sure you have all the correct tick boxes. Excuse me. Store electronic data securely, ideally on some sort of database. I promote the proactive CRM because that's great. I can update whether I've got GDPR consent or whether it's legitimate interest and the date and what sort of consent I've got. So that helps me. So I would say this is a great time to migrate to some sort of CRM, but make sure that if things are on your device is password protected, ideally by facial recognition or by fingerprint, because that's more secure. In terms of physical data, bits of paper, is it in a locked space or is it in a locked room? What you mustn't do is leave personal data lying around. In the networking meeting, I gave the example of what would happen if Mel left our contract data out and went to get a cup of tea. Well, technically, that's a data breach because anyone could have a look at it and see our personal details like name and address and perhaps find some financial information. And dispose of unnecessary data. So taking the physical data, bits of paper first, potentially by a shredder. With electronic data, you need to have a look and see, is it relevant that you still have it? If it's old or you don't know who it belongs to, get rid of it. And I've got rid of about 2/3 of my records because it's just too complicated to go through it. Otherwise, anyone I'm not sure about, just get rid of. You can always add it on again later, but what you don't want to do is fall foul of the rules for a silly reason. So having done all that, I've got some useful resources for you. Now, please, those of you who are at the meeting, take Jane's handouts. They're very, very good indeed. Go through them, they will help you. But here are some links you can click on and some things that will help you. So to register with the Information Commissioner's Office, here's the link. I think it's still £35. It's very fast. It took me 5 minutes. The ICO also has a really helpful checklist which you can go through and you can see how GDPR ready you are, and it grades you. So it's kind of tick boxes. Have you done this? Have you done that? Have you done this? Have you done that? And then it highlights what you need to work on most and where you are compliant already. I found that really useful. There is a Ticket Tailor downloadable privacy policy. That's quite a mouthful. Which, if you want, just let me know and I'll pop it over to you. But if you use Ticket Tailor yourself, check your emails because it came about 2 weeks ago. And then if you need a GDPR compliant CRM system, this is proactive. This is the one that I promote, and I will. Anyone who signs up to it, you get 45 days for free. So if nothing else, it will get you compliant by the 25th of May. Then, of course, it's up to you whether you use it. But I do provide free training on this as well. And I think it's a great resource. It's really helped me. So don't panic. I think most of you guys will be absolutely fine. Remember, it's about proportionate steps. You can't ignore it. Don't put your head in the sand. It's going to come. And Jordan asked the question, what if you're not quite ready on the 25th? They'll just turn around to you and they will say you've had 2 years to do this. So make sure you're as compliant as you can be. Set aside some time. Don't panic. Be sensible. Be methodical. If you really can't do it yourself, there are plenty of people who will take your money to help you get set up. But don't leave it to the last minute and panic. Okay? Take care. Hope to see you all soon, probably at the next MBN meeting. Bye-bye.